Hello, everyone. My name is Jenn Folli. I am a registered dietitian with a degree in public health policy and systems, and I'm excited to have the pleasure to speak with you today. I am going to pull up my slides here. So today we're going to talk about public health policy analysis and the U.S. legislative and regulatory process. And I noted in your reading that you did spend a lot of time talking through policy analysis, which is awesome. But I think it would behoove everyone to also take some time and look at the legislative and regulatory process too. So I do spend the bulk of the time in this lecture series talking about legislative and regulatory process. To give a little background, I told you my degree is in public health policy and systems analysis. In my previous job, I worked for a government contractor that did public health policy analysis at the state level. So we looked at 50 state landscapes related to public health problems, specifically tobacco and obesity prevention and hunger. From there, so I spent a lot of time, I spent about 5 years doing policy analysis for that company. And then from there, I did become a registered lobbyist and government affairs specialist for a trade and professional association in DC, where I learned in depth the legislative and regulatory process as well. So I'm happy to share both of those experiences with you and to dive in a little bit more on the theoretical frameworks for each of these as well. So I did, as I mentioned, I did say I wanted to kind of start out actually bringing it all together. So policy analysis is, and then the legislative process or the regulatory process can be two separate beasts. And I think that when we're thinking more practically about policy and how it kind of works together, or how it can work together with politics, we really do need to have a pretty good framework to understand that. So I'm not sure if anybody has heard of the Kingdon 3 streams model, policy streams model, but he divides it into 3 different areas. So the problem, what is the problem? Will it get better over time? And is it solvable through a policy stream? The policy stream, what are the solutions that could be achieved through policy? So you might have a bunch of people working on policy analysis, like looking through your CDC framework, identifying stakeholders, who's going to benefit, who's not going to benefit, looking through the budget impacts, reading through economic modeling, looking at epidemiological data. There is a whole set of people and analysts looking at policy solutions in the policy stream. And then you have politics. And politics is basically public opinion, and then political procedure. And I will focus on, I'm going to focus on the US federal legislative process and the regulatory process in the politics stream. So all of these 3 fit together, and they're all going kind of at the same time. So they all can be going at the same time. So you have the problem stream, you're trying to identify the problem could be changing over time. And then you have the policy stream, or the solutions that you could propose through policy. And like I said, you have people that are doing all the analysis on that, looking at economic impacts, looking at budgetary impacts. And that stream is kind of going at the same time. And then you have the politics stream and the public opinion stream. And that's ebbing and flowing and ebbing and flowing. And that could that could be you might have someone who's in a very influential policy role start talking about your problem, or start talking about, um, his sister or her sister that is suffering from heart disease. And oh my gosh, you have been defining what heart disease is, and looking at heart disease in this specific population that his or her sister is now suffering from. And you've also been working on policy solutions with the American Heart Association that could address his or her sister's, the politician's sister's, um, heart disease. And so all three of these streams could then intersect, and you see what Kingdon calls a policy window. So it's a window of opportunity where things actually could happen, but you have to have these three streams kind of lining up. And as you'll see up before that, the problem and the policy solution can intersect and there'll be no change. So you could be defining the problem, you could have already found a policy solution, but if you don't have political will and you don't have public opinion, nothing's going to happen. The same goes for if, the policy solution and the politics intersect, but the policy solutions aren't necessarily addressing the problem, or it's not a correct solution that's going to be addressing the problem. You won't have that policy window or that opportunity open. So when I was studying, I thought this was really a very simple way to understand how you have to, if you want something to happen in the policy realm, these are the three things that you need to be thinking about and need to be addressing at all times. And so if you are solely in research and you're only doing policy research, then you don't have to worry about it. But if you are trying to make change and make lasting change, you need to consider all three of these. So let's go ahead and just go through what we might, I'm going to dive into the policy stream a little bit, and policy stream meaning policy analysis, and things that you should consider when you're thinking through, your policy analysis are jurisdiction, and we'll go into that a little bit, whether it's legislative or regulatory in your policy solution, and where in the process of policy development are we. So are we at the beginning? Are we in that problem identification area? Are we working to really identify and really hone in on what exactly is the problem? Are we looking at epidemiological data? Are we understanding what disease state we're in? From there, it's the policy analysis or the policy development. So, we're going through that CDC framework. And we're answering all those questions. I loved that you had that framework up and that you were answering all those questions about framing, economic impacts, budgetary impacts, who is going to be impacted. So I like in your reading also in the CDC framework, you'll note that the stakeholder engagement and education in this circle is right at the center and needs to be done at all times in each stage of these processes. So, and then the purple little thing at the bottom, the strategy and the policy, now that's sort of getting into, okay, well, where are we on that political stream or the public opinion stream? And so you can think through a strategy, and it's always good to have strategy, but you need to be able to flex and adjust your strategy to be able to get all three of those streams kind of intersecting, so you get the policy window opening. You'll have to excuse me, my husband's coming home, so my dog is barking. So anyway, I just want to say that I really enjoyed reading through the CDC's policy analytical framework, and I think it's a great document for identifying the problem and for identifying the problem on Kingdon's policy stream model, and then also thinking through political or policy solutions. Now, where I think it could use some help, and potentially because this is a government body putting this out, they don't necessarily dive into the politics or the public opinion side, and how to analyze that and how to strategize for that. So I thought we'd spend some time there. Just a basic review of responsibilities. We have the legislative branch, which makes the laws, and the legislative branch is Congress, which it is composed of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive branch carries out the laws. You have the president, the vice president, and the cabinet, and the agencies. So a lot of the agencies that, and we'll go into that, carry out and they make rules or regulatory policy. So a cabinet member might be the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Those are the executive branch. Oops. The other is the judicial branch, and that interprets the laws. That includes the Supreme Court and other federal courts. So jurisdiction. I just wanted to go over this really quickly. So jurisdiction is sorry, I'm back. So jurisdiction, that's important when you're thinking through your strategy or you're trying to identify your strategy in your political stream. So just as a quick review, jurisdiction is codified in the U.S. Constitution, and it states that, and it through the 10th Amendment, it's to the Constitution. It says that powers not granted to the federal government are reserved for states and the people, which are divided between state and local governments. So when you're thinking through your strategy and which policy levers might be a solution for you, you really need to understand, are you thinking federal policy? Are you thinking state policy? Are you thinking local policy? And knowing the jurisdiction of each of those will help inform you what type of solutions you could propose that would be appropriate for each of these levels of government. So federal, examples of federal jurisdiction, so anything that's of national significance, like interstate commerce, you have federal taxes, the right to create an army and then create coin or make sure that we all have the same dollar bill. State, you are looking at schools, the trade between states, so interstate, elections, taxes, and public health and safety. So that's a big one. That should raise a red flag for everyone on this call. Local, parks and recs, services, police and fire departments, housing services, emergency medical services, municipal courts, and transportation and public works. So including public transportation, which might also be of interest for folks on this call. So types of policy, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. There's legislative and the regulatory. And legislative, so at the federal and at the state level, you have legislative and regulatory policy. Local is a little bit different and a little bit more out of my realm of expertise. So I'm not going to go there, but legislative is a statute. So it's when a bill becomes a law, and they have what's called an appropriation bill. And those bills typically are not, they're good for like a year. They are spending bills. And in the appropriations committees, there are 12 different subcommittees that are working on spending bills, and they have to pass them every single year. So annually, these spending bills come up and are debated to fund the government. Now, regulatory administrative rules provide guidance to the agencies on how to administer the laws. So these are like, we pass the Farm Bill. So Congress passes the Farm Bill, and the Department of Agriculture, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is in charge of creating rules on how to interpret and administer the law. So I explain it like The law creates a framework. So it creates like the frame of a house. The rules, or the administrative rules in the regulatory bodies, put up the walls and put some decorations on the walls. So they really fill in the detail of how the law is supposed to be interpreted and administered. So just as a reminder, the legislative branch is Congress, and it has 100 senators. 2 senators from each state represent that state regardless of the population. And there's 435 representatives, and each one of those representatives represents about 700,000 citizens. So South Dakota has 2 senators, just like every other state, and they have 1 representative. Whereas if you go to California, they have something like 50 representatives. It might even be more than that now. So as you can see, if you were thinking about strategy from a national level, our senators are extremely overrepresented when it comes to number of population. If you compare, we have 2 senators and California has 2 senators, and they have almost 50 times the population as South Dakota. So something to consider. So very quickly, but also very important, the legislative process, and which changes statute. So I'm just going to run through this very quickly, but I would keep this slide handy, just because it's good to know, especially when you're doing a policy analysis or policy feasibility study. So a bill is introduced. It's assigned to a committee, which means that based on the content of the bill, the bill is assigned to the committee that would have jurisdiction or would have expertise in the content area of that bill. If we're lucky enough, so all of these are if we're lucky enough. These 2 steps, the first step, introduce, assign to committee, happen pretty seamlessly. There's no real opportunity for lobbying. There could be, but there's so many more steps down the road where there's opportunity to advocate. This one happens pretty quickly. As soon as it gets to committee, though, you do have time, especially when you're thinking through that policy development stage, when you're thinking about the problem, when you're thinking about what policy solutions might come into play. This is where you have those conversations with the policymakers that are in those committees, because these folks that are on these committees have the most expertise in the area that you're discussing. They are going to go deeper than the 415 other members of the House of Representatives or the 90 other senators. These are the people that are going to have those in-depth policy debates with you. So this is a time to really think through, if you have your policy solutions in hand, you have the problem clearly defined, it's time to start talking to those members on that committee. So if you're lucky enough to get a debate in committee or to have the committee do a hearing on your bill or your policy solution, awesome. That doesn't always happen. In fact, I would say the majority of bills don't get debated in committee. But the next step is if they debate in committee and they have a vote, it's passed out of the committee. Then there's a process of deciding if this is going to be debated on a larger stage. So is it going to go, and are all of the House of Representative members going to debate this and vote on this, or are all the senators going to debate this and vote on this? And that's what's called debate on the House or the Senate floor. But if you're in the House, you have to go through what's called the House Rules Committee, and that defines what type of debate there is. So on the House side, this might be, they might not allow debate when it goes to the House floor. There might not be an opportunity for amendments to the bill, or there might be opportunity for amendments. And so this is kind of where those rules come into play. So, and there's definitely strategy behind both of those options. Now on the Senate, there is another option where you can, if you feel like this is a very non-controversial bill, you have unanimous support, people seem to think this is a no-brainer, you can do what's called a hotline, and you say you forfeit. So when I say you, the sponsors of the bill, so the senators who sponsored the bill, forfeit their any time on the floor of the Senate, and they forfeit any debate, and they ask all the senators to just weigh in very quickly on what's called this hotline line. It's literally a phone line, and then it can move to the floor very quickly, and everybody votes unanimously, and it moves. Once that happens in either the House or the Senate, if it passes either chamber, it needs to move to the other chamber. Alternatively, if the other chamber has also been debating this issue, they might also have their version of a bill. And if that happens, then they can skip this vote in chamber and they can go right to conference committee. But if the House has a bill and the Senate hasn't debated anything on this topic, then it needs to go over to that chamber and they need to debate the House's version of whatever bill that is. So, but if the House and the Senate have been working on a similar bill, then, and they pass both of those in each of the House and Senate, then it can go to the conference committee, and that is a select number of House and Senate members that debate the differences between the two bills. This is a lot of detail. I hope this is not too much for you guys, but this is important. They debate those, and they come out with an agreed upon compromise, and then both chambers have to pass that agreed upon compromise, and then it gets sent to the president. And he or she can veto, and then we have to start the process all over again. So that was very long, and I hope you paused it and took a breath in there. Okay. Let me see if I can move this along. Okay, so the regulatory process, while very important, is not as complex. It's pretty straightforward most of the time. So step one, an agency creates a draft of a proposed rule. Step two, the draft proposed rule is reviewed and approved by the agency. So that's very internal. That would be like USDA staff talking to USDA staff. Then from there, if we get approval, it will go to budget, or it will go to like a review, an internal review sector within the agency. A notice of proposed rulemaking is published in the Federal Register. So the Federal Register is basically a place where the public can look and see what the agencies are doing and what they have to make public. So that each of their rules that they promulgate has to be noted in the Federal Register. The Federal Register, you can go ahead and read it. It comes out every day. So that's where this notice of proposed rulemaking will come out. This is the first time that you as the public will see this. Each of those proposed rulemaking, each of the proposed rules you have to have at least 30 days for the public to review and allow for an open public comment period. I don't know what the percentage is, but when I was doing our work for the association, I would say the majority of those rules were 60 to 90 day open public or public comment period. So you could you could digest what the rule was saying, you could talk to your stakeholders and see if that rule would work for them, and then you could write a public comment. Okay, so the agency, and then you would submit that. So you as a citizen can do that. You can read those regulations and you can submit a public comment for the record on whether you think that is a good idea or a bad idea or where you would make changes. We did that as an association and carried the voice of our 75,000 members. And so the agency, whoever promulgated that proposed rule, would review those comments and would review the draft, and they would create a final rule, and the final rule would be published, and then that was it. That was final rule, and you were stuck with it if you didn't like it, or you were rejoicing if you did. And in that final rule, it would also give you a timeline of when that rule would be implemented and when it would be administrative law. Okay, I just wanted to note that these are some agencies doing public health work that you might want to take a look at. If you're going to look at the Federal Register, these are the agencies that you might want to just kind of do a search for, like a control find, to see what kind of rules they're putting out. You know, so this is the U.S. Department of Transportation, the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I just wanted to provide, in closing, I wanted to provide just an example of what you might see as, or just an example of how the policy streams can intersect and have intersected, from my work at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So as a dietitian, we are constantly looking at food insecurity and how that impacts chronic disease, specifically looking at different populations and how that impacts those populations. So we were looking at problem definitions for many populations, and seeing how food security was impacting them. One population that came to light that was really kind of unusual, or one that we were maybe not unusual, but really surprised at, was our veterans, and how many of them were food insecure, and really saw this as an opportunity to raise awareness for this population, because you know, veterans and the military is not necessarily a Democrat or a Republican issue. We really felt like this was an issue that we as a country should start really, I mean, this shouldn't be happening at all. So we worked with a bunch of national groups and the VA to define the problem, like really, really narrow it down. And then from there, we created a policy solutions document. So that's what this document is over here on the right: food insecurity among active duty service members and veterans. So we laid out the problem, and we laid out what kind of policy solutions we as an association found would address these problems. And then we started hearing that there was a lot of chatter on Capitol Hill about this. There started being many hearings on this issue in many different committees. So you'd have a committee, like the Armed Services Committee would be talking about this, but then you'd go over to the Agriculture Committee and they'd be talking about this. And so we saw that there was some ground softening in the policy window. You know, public opinion on this might be shifting. And finally, we didn't have to, this group, that the stakeholders that we were working with, we didn't necessarily have to pass a law. The VA actually got the go-ahead to go ahead and try and fix this in an administrative way. So they did put in a food security or hunger question, so screening, that goes, you know, if you're admitted into the VA or you're there for outpatient. They were starting to roll out, when I left, this food security or hunger screening tool. So they were at least going to be able to start identifying people as they came in as being hungry or food insecure. So felt like that was a win, and one that's going to be sustainable over, you know, that's a policy change that will be sustainable. You know, it's not going to go away. the VA has decided to do it, and they've got the support of Congress to do it too. So we felt really, really good about that. And really, all three of those streams, the policy or the problem, the policy solutions, and the politics or public opinion all lined up for that policy window to open, and we were ready. We felt good about that. So I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I hope that you are passionate about policy. I hope that you recognize that it is extremely important. The work that we do as public health professionals is so community driven. You know, it's community driven, it's people driven, but we have to also be willing to tell those stories to the people that make policy decisions about our programs and the populations that we work with. So I hope you learned something today, and I hope you felt like the lecture was worthwhile. And I look forward to hearing how any feedback that you all had. Have a great night.